First of all, a big welcome to those of you who are new from the most recent beginners course. So I think you've seen Saluting the Shrine before? Yeah, great. So if you've not, that's fine. So we're going to do a call and response thing where we just sort of remind ourselves of why we're here in a sort of ritual way. So we're going to say some words to the shrine. Feel free to join in. If you don't want to, that's fine as well. Namo Buddhaya.
Namo Buddhaya.
Namo Dhammaya.
Namo Dhammaya.
Namo Sanghaya.
Namo Sanghaya.
Namo Namah.
Namo Namah.
Om.
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 Okay, so welcome to the next sort of session in our, we've got a bit of a series going on where we are exploring figures from the Refuge tree. So for those of you who haven't seen any of the previous ones, I sort of won't explain too much about that, except to say that it's a sort of, it is an image which brings together lots of figures from the Buddhist tradition generally, but figures that are particularly relevant for us practicing in Triratna. There's a particular group of figures on that image called the five Buddhas. And last week we had Kashantaka talking about them and some of what they represent, and sort of leading us into a bit of an exploration of them. And this week I'm continuing that by diving in a bit deeper into Vairocana and sort of one way of understanding him as a figure and what he represents. So I'm going to say a little bit more. There is a sort of meditation to explore that a bit more experientially, and we'll have a bit of a chance in the second half to talk in little groups as well about some of how we might find we might be in contact with something of what he represents in our own experience. Just to kind of set the scene a little bit. So who is Vairocana? Well, the simple answer is he is the white Buddha in the center of the five Buddha mandala, who's pictured on our shrine with this image on I think it's the left, on my left. So your left if you're looking at the shrine, my left as I'm pointing. So he is in an interesting position because he's both part of this kind of group of figures, but he also sort of represents the fusion of the other four. So we're not going to go into everything that could be said about them. They're very rich set of figures. But he is his sort of hand. Just to say a little bit about his symbolism. His hand kind of symbol, his mudra, is the teaching mudra. So he's often pictured as holding a wheel, which represents the Dharma, one of the classic symbols for the Dharma in the Buddhist teaching. He's obviously white, so that's the sort of a very pure kind of color of white. So there's often this idea that when we're talking about Buddhas and Bodhisattvas, these kind of visionary figures from the Buddhist tradition, they're not sort of, they're sort of made of light. So they're not just like a person who's been painted green like some sort of cosplayer. They're like, or white in this case. They are, they're beings made of light. That's when we're sort of visualizing or picturing them. That's what they are sort of supposed to be. He's associated with kingship, which is part of where this kind of wheel symbol comes in, and his animal that he's associated with is the lion, which again, symbol for kingship. Yeah, so that's sort of a bit about what you would see if you look at the picture. In another way, we might think of him as, if you took Shakyamuni, the kind of historical source of the Buddhist tradition, and you wanted to sort of lift him onto a sort of archetypal level or express something of the essence of what he was in a way that is sort of outside of time, something like that, what you would end up with is this sort of Vairocana, is this cosmic Buddha who's sort of everywhere and sort of always has been and always will be. So you've got all of the figures that we have on the refuge tree, all of the Buddhas and Bodhisattvas, and actually all of the teachers from the past that we've talked about already, they all come from Shakyamuni. But there's another sense in that they sort of come from somewhere else, that famously Shakyamuni also realized that the historical Buddha also came to this realization after he'd reached enlightenment, that he needed something to look up to. And that for him was the Dharma, the kind of the principle of reality, which his teachings were all pointing to. And then, so that sort of leaves us with, and there are also stories that he's sort of not the first Buddha, like these are in the Pali Canon, that there have been Buddhas in the distant past, and there will be another Buddha in the distant future. So already in that earliest kind of layer of the texts of the Buddhist tradition, you have this idea that yes, there's this one human person who lived at a particular time, but there's also some sort of principle which he is the latest manifestation of. And Vairocana is another manifestation of that. For me, he's the figure that I meditate on, that I took at ordination. He's sort of, that's kind of what he represents, is that Buddha principle outside of, written cosmically large. There are obviously challenges to introducing him. The last time I spoke about him, I spoke quite a lot about that, and I also spoke about reasons why it might be difficult to talk about him. One of the reasons is that just in the context of that five Buddha mandala, so he's one of the five, but he's also the fusion of the other four, and they're already like sort of massive figures that you can spend your whole life meditating on them and that can be incredibly transformative. So what does it mean to like compress all four, not compress, but to like smush them all together, to put it crudely? How do you even begin to talk about that? And I think we can easily, when you try and have someone who has every quality, that can easily result in imagining someone who has basically no qualities. And I know for myself, my kind of journey in relating to Vairocana as a figure has involved trying to get more of a sense of, in a way, it has been an exploration of, okay, what does that really mean to sort of experience the fullness of the qualities of an enlightened consciousness in their kind of raw, pure kind of form. And I can very easily fall into, this is something I notice in the way when I call into mind, so I very easily fall into thinking about this enlightened being and the way they might think or perceive me. And it's like he can be a bit cold and a bit distant, or rather the mental picture I form can seem a bit cold or a bit distant. Really, it's not really him, it's my kind of mental image of him. But I think that the challenge is one that's worth accepting. Like, to just have these images of the goal and of a sort of embodied, pure consciousness in a very potent raw form. Like what is that really like? Yeah, so I enjoy the challenge of Vairocana and trying to call him into my mind. So one way of sort of expanding or avoiding some of the pitfalls that we might get into is by bearing in mind these other figures which we touched on last week. And we're going to do that in a bit of meditation now. So so I've already touched on this idea that Vairocana is in a sense a kind of combination of the other four, to put it reductively. But one sort of easy image for that is that if you combine all of the colors of light, you end up with white light. If you shine white light through a prism, you end up with this kind of rainbow. So I thought what we would do is we will partly to sort of see what your own response is to this kind of one of the essential aspects of him as a figure, like when you call white light to mind, with the sense that it's coming from a great enlightened awareness. How do you experience that? What emotional tone does that have automatically for you? And then we're going to bring in just a few suggestions which are kind of informed by the other Buddhas. So we're going to bring in an awareness that of red light. There's this and a warmth that's connected with that, and then we'll go through the other four. So you don't need to know anything about those figures. You just need to be sort of curious about your associations with color, I suppose, and willing to just sort of explore your associations. So if you want to get settled, I'm just going to grab myself a blanket. So you're just closing your eyes. Continuing to settle ourselves for the meditation. Tuning into the body a bit more. Letting go of any areas of tension, if we can. And if there are thoughts just knocking around from the day, seeing if we can set them aside. So we're just going to begin by calling to mind a white light. So you might be able to visualize that clearly, and so that's great. Perhaps it's coming down slightly above. If you're not getting a clear image, that's fine. Just have to have willing to have this sense that there's something coming towards us. It's a very bright, very clear white light, like bright sunlight shining on clean snow. And it's not necessarily just something that's coming in through our eyes, so to speak. We can let it into the whole body. And just noticing what your reaction is to calling the white light to mind. Does it have a particular association or emotional tone for you? Does it seem attractive or something we want to move away from? Does it seem warm or cold, or sharp or soft? There's no right answer. If we can have some sense that this isn't just a color, not just light rays, something coming from another consciousness, a great, deeply developed other mind, even if we view that as our own potential. one aspect present in the white light is a quality of clarity. Those of you who are familiar with Akshobhya, the blue Buddha that was introduced last week, connecting with some of the qualities that he represents. And we could even turn the white light blue temporarily. It's the clear blue of sapphires. What would it be like to have total clarity of mind? So no aspect of our experience is distorted. All of that sharp blue clarity is present in the white light. And now, in that white light, we're allowing it to take on more of a yellow hue. In terms of the five Buddhas, this is Ratnasambhava, quality of abundance, sort of generousness of mind. And still that rich yellow light is pouring out, and we can receive it, accepting it potentially as an answer to any sense of lack we might find within ourselves. And coming back to the white light again. Aware that the qualities of abundance are still there, as are those of clarity. And whenever you're ready, you can allow the whiteness to take on a reddish quality. Now we're bringing Amitabha, his qualities, into focus. It's the warm, soft red, like light through rubies. Balancing any of the sense of coldness that we may have imagined having called that clarity of Akshobhya to mind. That redness is alive with the lover's appreciation of the uniqueness of every individual living thing. And as we've been calling these colours to mind, still noticing our reactions to them, how the emotional tone of our experience changes, which ones we find more inviting or more off-putting. And again, letting that redness take its place in the white light. And now a green hue emerges. Sort of emerald tone. There's a strong sense of energy, unobstructed success, and fearlessness. And again, letting that light in, seeing how we react to the suggestion. And letting the green light take its place in the combined white light. As we return again to that pure white light, like brilliant sun on pure snow, and coming back to it knowing that it has all of those qualities contained within it. So the blue clarity, the yellow abundance, red warmth, and green energetic and fearless. All those qualities are present, perfectly poised, perfectly able to respond to whatever the moment asks of it. Just as the mind of an enlightened being is able to freely respond to life. And whenever you're ready, you can let go of the effort to imagine the white light. And just bring the meditation to a close. So we've got a few minutes before the tea break. If anyone has any reflections or responses, what was that? How was that like for you? Did anyone notice any particular responses to calling white light to mind, or any of the colours.
White light was very purifying.
Hmm.
I think the others just invoke different kinds of emotions.
Hmm. But they did feel sort of distinct.
Yeah, they did, yeah.
Mm.
Yeah. Each of them had a different visualization. Different imagery into minds.
Yeah, great. Any other responses? Anyone just really struggle to call anything to mind? Yeah.
The mudras, because I find that
Yeah, sure.
easier than the
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah, there's sort of it's one of the nice things about about the five Buddha mandala is that they have so many different dimensions. That they've got sort of a series of hand symbols. There's the colours. There's as I mentioned before, they've all got associated animals. It's a very kind of rich, multifaceted set of symbols and associations. In a way, I was sort of trying to just take us a bit deeper into one aspect of that and how you might experience it sort of slightly less kind of conceptual way. Like it's just a color that you kind of, it's not really I don't know, there's a sort of immediacy about our response to color, which is not so it's not so conceptual. But yes, it's always interesting to hear what aspects people were drawn to, and it's probably that's one of the nice things about them being so rich, is that there's different kind of hooks to get stuck into. So we will have the tea break in a moment, and then we'll come back up and I'll talk a little bit more about sort of the main theme of the evening. So just to sort of touch on that before we go downstairs. So we've had these kind of different qualities evoked, and then like what holds those together. And in one way of thinking about it is that it's mindfulness that contains or balances those different faculties, and that's the spiritual faculty that the Vairocana is connected with. And it's a bit more about that and this sort of deeper aspects of mindfulness. So perhaps another way of looking at it than we might be used to. So that's what we're touching on in the second half. It's 8:19. I'm too fast. I guess if you want to make your way very slowly downstairs. Okay, well, welcome back. So we've already had a bit of a more experiential feel into some of the qualities that are associated with Vairocana, and I've already mentioned this idea that the spiritual faculty that he's closely associated with is mindfulness. So the wonderful thing about the five Buddha mandala is not only do they have all this richness of symbolism, but they're also mapped onto loads of the other lists. So if you enjoy any of the lists in Buddhism, they probably connect with the five Buddha mandala in some way. Not any. Well, it actually depends where you read, but they're very interconnected. So they can be a real kind of nerve center that kind of maps onto loads of other things. And one of them is the five spiritual faculties. And as I've said, it's mindfulness the Vairocana is connected to. And that mindfulness kind of balances those other qualities that the other Buddhists kind of bring in. So not only is he he's a kind of fusion of those, and yet there's some sense that it's also, they're being held in this larger space. But the thing about the balance, which I think is interesting, is that we often have this idea of balance, which is about sort of moderation, like you have a bit too much there, so you maybe take that down a bit and then you lift the other one up. And I don't think that's the kind of balancing that we're talking about here. Really, because there's a kind of, the Buddhists have those qualities to the infinite extent, and you can't really have too much generosity, or like in a certain way you can't really have too much of those qualities. But what I suppose is required is a sort of is knowing what quality is most appropriate, and what we maybe need to cultivate at any moment. So I think it's that sort of, in a sense, it's that kind of mindfulness. But I think trying to work out what on earth we're talking about when we talk about mindfulness in Vairocana representing mindfulness really forces you to kind of look a bit deeper at the whole notion of mindfulness. We're very kind of familiar with it as a concept. It's very widespread in our culture, but there's something about this figure that kind of forces you to go deeper in that. So that's what we're going to be looking at. So a lot of the time when we talk about mindfulness, my immediate associations are something to do with coming into the present moment. It's got a bit of a therapeutic angle, and and maybe something about a sort of concentrated quality of mind, all of which are good, and I can recognize those things in my own experience, kind of know what we're talking about when we say mindfulness in that term. But but it doesn't quite, I can't quite connect it with this notion of like all of those like really intense qualities that we've just sort of been trying to tap into. Like how does that kind of being in the present moment kind of balance those out or make sense of those? And I think that's because when you look at the terms that we translate as mindfulness, in Pali it's sati, smrti in Sanskrit, and literally means something like remembering or recollection. And I'm sure there's many connections that can be drawn from that and ways of interpreting it. But what I'm going to be talking about is sort of a recollection of a kind of, it's like we come back to a sort of basic aliveness in ourselves, which isn't really reducible to anything else. It's this fundamental responsiveness out of which then arises kindness, generosity, concentration, basically whatever is required. Sangha has this wonderful image of for the enlightened mind, that it's like when you sort of progressed sufficiently spiritually, it's as though the mind becomes a perfect sphere on a perfectly flat surface, that there's no resistance. It's able to go wherever it needs to as the kind of need arises, and like if you sort of have to, if you're trying to find a word for that that quality of poise, but also sort of potent potentiality, I think that is that quality which you could call mindfulness in this context. And each of the Buddhas also has in this mandala also has a kind of wisdom. So like when you sort of take their qualities to the nth degree, they embody a certain way of seeing reality, or a certain approach to the experience of seeing how things really are. And see things from sort of Vairocana's perspective is to sort of encounter the wisdom of the Dharma Dhatu, the sphere of the Dharma. And yeah, and that's the sense that the Dharma, the truth kind of permeates everything, and is present everywhere. And I think if you follow that notion of mindfulness, you kind of end up there. So I'll try and say a bit more about that. So that all sounds rather lofty and maybe a bit abstract. So what does that mean in terms of our own experience? And I think we can see it sort of all in loads of different aspects of our lives, in lots of different moments. Usually it's in moments. And I think it's those, so yeah, just to come up with a few examples, it's those moments which I think we've all had, and maybe they of what actually brought you here in the first place, where something, there's some sudden shift in awareness, something kind of breaks through, and you're aware that you need to change something. That might be one example. There's this sort of wonderful word, sort of epiphany. You have an epiphany. It's a sort of religious term, but it's also kind of part of English literature as well. Lots of characters in short stories have epiphanies where they suddenly realize something about the way they've been living their life, and they need to change, basically. And yeah, maybe we've had those moments. It's that it's sort of when the little voice in your mind that is telling you the thing you don't want to hear gets so loud that you can't ignore it anymore. It's those kinds of moments. But equally, it might be a kind of call to act, to do something, but it might equally be a call to stop doing something, or the moment when you suddenly name or see clearly some habit that is holding you back. Or equally, just this coming to rest, like this one is on my mind a lot, where you suddenly just stop, like on a very deep level, something in you comes to rest, which has been agitated and moving, shifting around. I think you get, so yeah, another example would be, you get these little miraculous moments in meditation where somehow you go from your mind being agitated and moving around, and then suddenly you are concentrated, or more concentrated, or more still, or however you want to talk about it. And how does that transition take place? I don't really know. It's a miracle. I don't have another word for it. There's something in you recognizes that you don't need to do all of this anymore, and you can just be there. And that to me feels like it's close to this something very basic and very fundamental about being alive and being human, which Vairocana points me towards. And that's in a way what I think is being talked about with mindfulness, that really what we're recollecting is that this kind of capacity which can't really be put into rules, to just be aware and respond out of that. And in a way, we can only really talk about it as, well, one way of talking about it is as a capacity, a kind of psychological phenomenon. But in a way, it doesn't exactly feel, in some of those examples, like it's you that does it. But it's also not you, so it's all a bit confusing. But you definitely know it when it's happened. So I've got a little bit more to say, but I wonder if we just have a few moments where we get together in maybe groups of, how many we got? Maybe groups of four, and just, yeah, maybe just have a chat about that. Are there moments in your life where you feel like there's been some quality of this? So the discussion questions are: have there been times when there's been some moment of deeper mindfulness, a sort of recollection of your deepest values, something that interrupts the flow of our usual kind of habit? And was there a greater sense of aliveness? When else might you feel this sort of sense of sort of quickening? This is the word I've used. So yeah, other examples you might have of this kind of responsiveness kind of coming alive in you. Do you want me to put you in groups? Can you?
And even with meditation, it's not necessarily the actual effort, it's just knowing that it's so that mind can exist under within that time frame, doesn't need to project itself any further forwards. It's really I've just triggered that now, so I'm sort of trying to think.
We want to, if we come back when you're ready. So any responses to that? Anyone would be willing to share? Any examples, or reflections, or go?
I think we recognise that there's different scales in which we can recognise these feelings and sensations, and that can be on a sort of daily level, cup of tea at the end of the day of work, or training coordination when you're in Spain for 3 months, and you can experience these things. I guess on different orders of magnitude. It's up to you, sort of where you want to find it. If the will is there, then you can find it.
Yeah. And yet there's some commonality, isn't there? Like we recognise there's something common to those like expressions of those kind of movements within us towards something. So for me, Vairocana is that thing that I'm moving towards. Like he embodies the source of and like goal of that movement within me, which I recognize in other people, whether they're sitting down at the end of a day to just being with their own thoughts, or whether they're taking the ordination vows, or any number of other ways that it comes out. And that's part of like what's helpful in a way about having a Buddha. Like they've sort of done it for us. Like they are like they exemplify the thing that you detect within yourself so perfectly that in a way it doesn't need to be you're not solely, it's not just yours, so you don't need to worry about it in the same way that if it was just like one, like a quality particular to you. Does that make any sense? There's yeah, I don't know. There's something about recognizing that those things they're on some shared continuum. And there's a connection between that and the perfect expression or representation of that, which is, yeah, for me that's Vairocana. Maybe it's the Buddha. Maybe it's some other figure that someone might think of. Yeah. Any? Thank you. Any other thoughts or responses? No, that's fine. Yeah. So yeah, as may have been apparent from the examples I gave or from the ones that you may have come up with, there's something slightly ineffable about why do these moments happen, or why do this what is it in us that kind of rises up sometimes, and how do we have more of that, and yeah, I think that's part of where figures like this come in handy, as in fact do all of the practices. Like they're even though I'm sort of talking about the one aspect of enlightenment in this very formless quality of just pure aliveness and absolute responsiveness with no preconceptions, no arbitrary kind of rule system that it's just kind of carrying out like a kind of robot. Most of our minds are not in the state where that just happens naturally. We experience these moments as momentary, because most of the time we're a bit kind of foggy, and you just occasionally you get these piercing moments of where something comes through the kind of fog. You sort of feel the presence of the sun, to use the kind of solar imagery that Vairocana is connected with. And we're fortunate because we have, we have the whole kind of spread of the Dharma, which is pointing us towards this enlightened mind, which has this quality. But there's something about it which I find really helpful to give it a personal, a personified form. Because it can so easily, when you're trying to call to mind, what would it really be like to be totally free, to be absolute, to have a total abundance of all those qualities that we had at the start, to be endlessly warm and friendly and abundant and never feel sort of emotionally impoverished or something like that, and to be totally clear. And it can just be so very disembodied, and we might end up taking some of the sort of teachings that are meant to kind of guide us towards that in a way that's quite literal and quite dry. And there's something for me about calling to mind those qualities in the form of a figure, which draws out this quality of aliveness, of sort of irreducible. I keep going back to the word aliveness. Yeah, of that, like, this dynamic, vibrant dimension to that, which somehow feels like it's which somehow feels both sort of lofty and distant, and like it's the basic stuff that we're sort of made from, that we're just a bit out of touch with most of the time. It's in some way the thing that actually defines us, our capacity to suddenly openly and directly engage with what's going on in our life in a creative way. That's sort of when we feel most alive, I think. And yet it's the thing that we're sort of out of touch with most of the time. So I'm offering that as a way of thinking about mindfulness, that it's a recollection of aliveness. That's kind of what we're encouraged to come back to. And and Vairocana is there as a representative of that. The wheel that he holds is the wheel of the Dharma. It's sort of he's turning, and when you're doing the visualization, the kind of sadhana that I do, this this beam of light emerges from the wheel and touches you on the crown of your head, and it's a kind of call to wake up. It's a charging or a sort of contacting of this embodiment of responsiveness and aliveness with that capacity which is latent in us. And for me, it touches something that's right at the root of like why I do this. Like it's quite a lot of hard work. You may have noticed, like trying to sort of be ethical and meditate and all of that stuff. And like, there's so many easier sources of pleasure for most of us. So why do it? And it's because it's. I just feel like I'm the most alive when I'm doing this. I don't have another sort of way of talking about it, really. It's sort of it feels like the best use I could be making of my time, to put it another way. And it sort of gives me a sense that on some existential level, that's sort of what we're here for. So that's sort of where the title of this talk comes from. This beating heart of reality. That if that capacity is something really fundamental to who we are and what we are, which the Buddha was sort of able to develop to its fullest extent, each time we can kind of come back to it, it's like that heart is kind of beating. So I'll sort of leave you with that image. We're ending a little bit early, but giving you enough to think about. So thank you very much for coming, and I hope to see you next week.